Friends, the phone conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump was a moment that the world has been waiting for with bated breath. However, Europe was probably the most nervous. Donald Trump, a man who is feared in Brussels no less than in Washington, has done exactly what Western elites have been trying to avoid for so long. He called Vladimir Putin. The conversation lasted almost an hour and a half, and its results threatened to overturn the entire international politics. Now, the fate of the conflicts in Eastern Europe, the future of European security, and the architecture of global politics itself depend not on Brussels bureaucrats and not on the pale leadership of Germany and France, but on two politicians who are not afraid to speak directly and rely on common sense. What did Putin and Trump talk about, and why did this conversation become a disaster for Brussels? I'll tell you everything now. Friends, let's get started. Donald Trump made an official statement following the talks, and his rhetoric turned out to be so far from the usual expectations for American politics that Europe froze in anxious anticipation. Trump stressed that it was not only about the conflict in Ukraine, but also about a wide range of issues, including the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, and even the role of the dollar in the global economy. Trump paid special attention to the historical ties between Russia and the United States, recalling that during the Second World War, both countries fought on the same side. He noted that Russia had suffered enormous losses, but the United States had not escaped casualties either. We both remembered the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought together during World War II and achieved tremendous success, Trump said, while stressing that Russia had lost tens of millions of people, and the United States had also suffered significant losses. This reference to historical unity is not accidental. Trump has long held the idea that Russia is not America's strategic enemy, and hostility between countries is beneficial only to bureaucrats and elites who feed off wars. Moreover, Trump has made it clear that there will be no defeat of Russia, and he wants to end the conflict because no one needs senseless sacrifices. The very fact that Putin used his campaign slogan "common sense" in a conversation with Trump speaks volumes. We talked about the strength of our countries and the great benefits that we could get from working together in the future. But first of all, as we both agreed, we must stop the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Trump said. President Putin even used my campaign slogan, "common sense." We both firmly believe in it. This is not just a political gesture, but a demonstration that Russia and the United States are able to reach an agreement without intermediaries, without Brussels, without meaningless consultations with European puppets. I have assigned Secretary of State Marco Rubio, CIA Director John Radcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Oles, and Ambassador to Washington Steve Ufa to lead the negotiations, which I am deeply convinced will be successful, Trump said. Now the reality has shocked Europe. No one asked, no one was informed, no one was invited to the negotiating table. The United States and Russia are directly discussing global security, while the EU is complaining about what is happening. Why is Europe in a panic? Over the past 2 years, Brussels officials and European leaders have been building a picture of the world in which they play a key role in making the right decisions on Ukraine. Their whole strategy was based on the fact that no important decision is made without the European Union. Now, reality has hit the ego of European politicians hard. While they were talking about the inadmissibility of compromises and continued to drive their economies into recession, Trump decided to talk directly without Europe, without Macron, Scholz, and von der Leyen. And now attention, Trump called Putin. His statement following the talks did not contain the usual theses for von der Leyen, Scholz, and Macron that Russia must lose, that Russia needs to be strategically defeated. On the contrary, Trump paid tribute to Russian-American cooperation during World War II. This is not just a political gesture, but a real blow to European political attitudes, which were based on creating an enemy image of Russia. This policy of Europe collapsed in an hour and a half, in just the duration of one phone call. Europe's policy of creating an anti-Russian coalition was effectively destroyed by Trump's statement about the need to build a dialogue with Russia. Political scientists in the United States and Europe have already begun to analyze the consequences of the telephone conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. American expert Douglas Macgregor, a former Pentagon advisor, noted that Trump is well aware that the conflict into which the United States has dragged the country through bureaucrats and military corporations is a dead end. He is convinced that Trump will act not in the interests of lobbyists, but in the interests of American taxpayers, which means that funding for the conflict will be sharply reduced. Another American analyst, political commentator Tucker Carlson, said that this conversation had become a nightmare for the deep state. He stressed that the American establishment is in a panic because the prospect of a real peaceful settlement contradicts the long-term strategy of weakening Russia through proxy conflicts. Europe has not yet realized the full scale of the blow inflicted on its position by the negotiations between Putin and Trump. Trump was pleased with the conversation, and Putin outlined the approximate framework within which Russia is ready to complete its operation and the current conflict. According to Russian media reports, Russia is ready to consolidate all territories under its de facto control. The question of the legal status of these regions remains open. Some of them can be recognized as part of Russia immediately, and some will formally remain under temporary administration with a referendum. This option is being discussed on international platforms and, according to a number of analysts, may become the basis for a diplomatic compromise. One of the key conditions for a peaceful settlement remains the refusal of the country involved in the conflict from membership in NATO, and this point should be fixed not only in international treaties, but also in the constitution of this country. In addition, there are opinions that the president of this country will be required to fulfill a number of political conditions within the state, including ending the persecution of opposition and religious forces, as well as allowing all political movements to participate in elections. A full amnesty for the parties to the conflict may become part of a possible agreement. Another important issue is sanctions against Russia. Apparently, they will be removed gradually, synchronizing the process with the implementation of peace agreements. European capitals are well aware that the sanctions imposed have caused enormous damage to Europe, while Russia has been able to adapt to the new conditions and even benefit from them. As a result, the Russian economy has benefited from the sanctions and continues to develop, while Europe is increasingly immersed in discussions about how to restore competitiveness to its economy. The frozen Russian assets, which were supposed to be used as leverage, can be unblocked and returned to Moscow, which will be a serious blow to politicians who base their strategy on the idea of a complete economic strangulation of Russia. Now it remains only to observe the development of events. The next test will be the next meeting of the Ramstein participating countries, where globalists will try to convince their protégés to continue the conflict and not compromise. However, the situation is such that the president of a country involved in the conflict has little choice. Every day his maneuvers are becoming more limited, and his political future is becoming more uncertain. He was pinned against the wall, and every step he took could lead to losses. The agreement on future mutual visits was particularly significant. We have agreed to cooperate closely, including mutual visits to our countries. We also agreed to instruct our teams to start negotiations immediately, and the first step will be to call the president of a country that is in conflict with Russia to inform him about our conversation, Putin and Trump said. This is no longer just a diplomatic gesture, but a demonstration of readiness for direct negotiations and a review of global trends. Now we can safely assume that Donald Trump may well come to Moscow to celebrate the 80th anniversary of victory. The American leader is no longer going to play the games against Russia imposed on him by the establishment. It is possible that Vladimir Putin may visit Washington, and this visit may become a real turning point in U.S.-Chinese relations. While European officials wrote resolutions and held summits, key decisions on global issues were made without their participation. Now they are not just not participating in the negotiations, they are not even notified of what is happening. Macron, who was so eager to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, stayed away. Scholz, whose policies led Germany to economic collapse, can now only watch as his country is turned into the periphery of world politics. Von der Leyen, who threatened to tighten sanctions, found herself in a situation where sanctions did not work, and Russia is quietly negotiating with the United States to lift them. This phone conversation between Trump and Putin has changed the rules of the game, and now it is obvious to everyone that these two leaders are able to reach an agreement without the participation of Europe. This is the end of the illusion of European leadership. If negotiations continue and the United States does change course, Europe will find itself in an even more pitiful position. The economy has been destroyed by sanctions, military supplies to Ukraine have been exhausted, and influence on global processes has been lost. The only question that remains open is when in Europe they realize that they have been used in someone else's geopolitical game. Another information bomb has occurred in Europe which could turn into a real political earthquake. The visit of Alice Weidel, chairman of the Alternative for Germany Party, to Budapest and her meeting with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stirred up not only the German media, but also the entire European political elite. The outcome of this meeting paints the prospect that Brussels was most afraid of, the formation of an alliance of right-wing forces capable of destroying the current order in the EU. For von der Leyen and her entourage, this was a blow below the belt, because Weidel and Orbán did not just exchange diplomatic pleasantries, but clearly outlined the future of Europe, in which Brussels and its elite may simply not have a place. For the first time, the idea of the need to change the political course, abandon the sanctions dictate and reconsider the role of the European Union in world politics was so openly expressed. During the negotiations, special attention was paid to energy policy and its disastrous consequences for Germany and the EU as a whole. Orbán, who consistently defends his country's economic interests, did not hide the obvious. Sanctions against Russia did not weaken Moscow, but dealt a huge blow to Europe itself. The figures speak for themselves. Industrial production in Germany has fallen by 6% over the past 2 years, the worst rate since World War II. In 2023, Germany lost €100 billion due to rising energy prices alone. More than 200 large enterprises have either reduced production or completely relocated their facilities outside the country. While Russian GDP grew by 35% in 2023 despite unprecedented sanctions. The point of all this is the simple truth. Sanctions have become a weapon that Europe has turned against itself. Orbán and Weidel have made it clear that the absurd situation in Europe must stop. They stressed that relations with Russia should be reviewed in favor of economic pragmatism rather than ideological obsession. One of the key topics was the perspective of the continent itself, and in this context, Viktor Orbán openly stated that current policies are leading Europe to decline. Decisions made in Brussels are increasingly contrary to the interests of European citizens, and it is difficult to argue with this. Ursula von der Leyen, appointed to the post without direct elections, has become a symbol of bureaucratic authoritarianism in Europe. Her decisions on energy, migration, agriculture, and finance are causing increasing outrage even among EU member states. Orbán proposed a radical reform of the European Union, in which the powers of Brussels would be significantly curtailed, and national governments would have more freedom in decision-making. Weidel supported this course, noting that Germany should regain its political sovereignty and not follow the directives from Brussels if they run counter to the interests of German citizens. The issue of migration became another important topic of negotiations, and here Weidel received support from Orbán, who has long proved that migration chaos can be stopped. Hungary is one of the few EU countries that has prevented a massive influx of illegal migrants by introducing strict border control measures. As a result, the crime rate in Hungary is one of the lowest in the EU, economic indicators are stable, and GDP growth is not inferior to the largest EU economies. Unlike Germany and France, where mass migration has led to the growth of ghettos and social conflicts, Hungary has no such problems. That is why Orbán called the migration program Alternatives for Germany right and necessary for Europe. Alice Weidel's visit to Budapest was not just a friendly visit, but a real signal of the formation of a new political coalition capable of changing the course of Europe. The right-wing forces of Europe are strengthening their ties, and this process cannot be stopped. As von der Leyen and her team continue to cling to power and promote policies that lead Europe into crisis, the number of countries and parties that no longer want to obey Brussels is growing. Orbán and Weidel have made it clear that they are ready to fight for a new Europe based on economic pragmatism and political common sense. And if the current EU bureaucracy doesn't want to hear this, then its place will be taken by those who truly represent the interests of Europeans. Friends, now I want to express my opinion. This material makes you think. The conversation between Trump and Putin is not just a diplomatic step, it is a blow to all those who are used to running the world, standing behind the scenes and not noticing the real problems. The path they have outlined does not just go beyond traditional politics, it calls into question the very model of global leadership that European elites have been trying to maintain for so long. Trump, despite all his unpredictability, has shown that he is ready to speak and act directly, without succumbing to manipulation. And Putin, in turn, has made it clear that Russia will defend its interests, but it is not closed to constructive dialogue. These negotiations can become historic if they really lead to a peaceful settlement. It's scary to imagine what will happen if Trump and Putin continue to act without intermediaries and Brussels. It's not just a conversation. It's the beginning of a new era. Many thanks to every viewer for their attention. Take care of yourself. See you, friends.